Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With the rising popularity of forage crops as a means to bridge the feed deficit this year, researcher Nicky Byrne gives us his tips and advice on managing these crops throughout the winter period.
There's definitely been an increase, I suppose, for specific crops. You could say that there's been a fourfold increase, and I suppose the most recent estimates will be that there's about 40,000 hectares of forage crops, westerbolls, and I suppose hybrids and Italian ryegrass species sown on farms across the country to bridge that, fodder deficit.
What are the reasons people use forage crops?
Yeah, so I suppose traditionally, forage crops have been used with great success, particularly for feeding your young stock, your maiden heifers. They offer a real high quality feed. And I suppose, where farmers were expanding and housing facilities were becoming under increasing pressure, people sowed forage crops, outwintered their young stock, and it, took a lot of pressure off there and still delivered very high animal performance. However, this year we're seeing them being used in a different scenario, and they were used, to bridge the fodder deficit. I suppose a lot of these forage crops have a very high yield potential and can grow over a relatively short growing period. So it's, in particular, we saw, a lot more forage crops sown from the end of July onwards. Traditionally we would see a lot of kale sown, sown down in May or June. But this year, it was kind of towards the end of the year after that drought to try and, replenish fodder stocks.
And you mentioned high quantity, and where you're sowing in May, you've quite a long growing season. What's going to be the effect this year of the later sowing date? Yeah,
so the later sowing date, I suppose one thing it did change, it changed the types of fodder crops that we were using. So, traditionally, our kales, they require, they have a much higher yield potential, but they need a longer growing period to realise that. So what we did see this year was, probably increased uses of hybrid brassicas. So they were cross between rape and kale. So I suppose from the end of July, early August, we saw a lot of those going in. And then later on in August, we would have seen, people switching back to forage rape after that. But I suppose as the year went on, your yield potential is reducing. So as a result of that, what we have seen is probably very variable crops. And, we probably got hit with secondary droughts as well. So there's a big variation in the yield that's on some of these crops.
And have you any advice for farmers on how they should assess the yield of their crops and when should they assess it for the winter?
These crops should have their full growing season, completed, I suppose, at the end of October. So they're perfect for grazing from the end of October onwards. But I suppose there's no harm in getting into them a little bit early. The crop will still be growing ahead of them. You're not going to be letting them into all of it. So you can start, grazing a little bit earlier than that. And, some of the crop will still be growing. But I suppose if you want to manage the crop properly and achieve good utilisation, you need to know, what your allocation is. You need to measure the crop. So I suppose the exact same as grass, use your quadrat, but you need to get a kind of a better representation of the yield than what we have with grass. So you're probably taking 4 quadrat cuts, whereas you might take one with our traditional grass quadrat. So yeah, it's the exact same as your grass measurement. We'd be taking about 12-13% as our dry matter percentage for these brassica crops. So I suppose just get a hedge clippers, cut the contents of the quadrat, put them into a meal bag, weigh them back and multiply it by your 12 or 13% dry matter, and that'll give you your herbage available per hectare.
And then if we move on to the quality, what is the quality of these feeds relative to, say, your grazed grass or a kilo of barley?
The quality of these forage crops is very, very high. They're a vegetative, actively grown crop with a high leaf proportion on them. And I suppose their quality comes to their detriment as well. These crops are in excess of 80% digestibility, so they're very rapidly fermentable in the animal, very fast passage rate, so we have to kind of counteract that with our fibre source. But I suppose the best thing to compare your forage crops to is that of spring grass. We know that there's just slightly over 1 UFL per kilo dry matter in our forage crops. So they're a real high quality feed, and farmers should take full advantage of that and prioritise stock that they need to get weight gain on over the winter and get those out on it and take the most from them.
So you're particularly targeting kind of young stock, the growing animals on your farm.
Exactly.
And if we talk through then day-to-day management of these forage crops, some people, it'll be their first time letting animals out. What should they look for in terms of maximising utilisation?
Before getting into the utilisation, I think, when farmers are initially, animals are introduced to this, on a gradual basis. So you kind of would give animals a transition period of about 7 to 10 days, adjusting their diet and including, increase the level of forage crop in their diet. Increase it by, I suppose, a kilo a day, or start them off with an hour's allocation and increase that up, as time goes on. I suppose what they need to be looking at now, they have a poor mineral profile. So I suppose before introducing them to the forage brassicas, farmers need to go in and address the mineral issue. So I suppose bolusing animals with a trace element bolus is probably the best and most reliable means of counteracting this. So that should be done now. And I suppose these forage brassicas can only make up 70% of the animal diets. That's the upper safe limit. So you have to provide a fibre source there. And I suppose an ad lib fibre source, to allow the animal, full-time access to the fibre. They'll eat what they require, but it's very important to have that there.
Just to pick up on that, Nicky, you mentioned that you need to include a forage source. That's typically provided in the form of silage. You see fields of, say, kale, and they have the silage bales dotted out across the paddock. Would you recommend farmers get out now with their silage and place it in the field in preparation for the winter?
Yeah, definitely. I think, get out now while ground conditions are still quite good. We want to avoid going in with tractors, dropping off a bale, in the month of December when ground conditions are poor, and that's when you're really going to cause damage to the soil and a compaction issue. That'll limit, when we're trying to get this back into grass, these fields back into grass or the next crop, that is going to be a problem. So, if you haven't done already, try and get your bales. You'll have a rough idea where your allocations are going to be going and the expected crop yield. Plot your bales out in the field now, and avoid having to go in there during the winter.
You mentioned that the forage crops are of really high quality. What sort of forage quality should you be targeting in conjunction with the forage crops?
Yeah, so I suppose what we need to provide is a form of roughage, so something with good fibre levels. So typically, your straw or hay are ideal for complementing your forage crop. But I suppose straw is probably going to be the limiting factor this year. So I think if farmers have access to hay or even average quality silage, use those as your roughage source for your animals grazing a forage brassica. Just use whatever silage is available. It's just to slow down the rate of passage, increase the rumination of these animals, and it'll help them overcome the real high digestibility of these forage crops.
And then in terms of the practicalities of day to day, when you're, fencing off area for the animals to graze, what do you recommend?
What I would recommend definitely is to use double fencing ahead of the animals, and I suppose that's a safety mechanism as well as reducing the workload on the farmer. If animals gorge themselves on the forage crops, they can be dangerous. So you want to avoid animals going hungry. Keep a double fence ahead of them and ensure it's not earthed and that there's good power in it. And that's where the double fence, it really reduces the risk of them breaking through and getting access to the full crop. And also when you're moving the animals, if you've a lot of animals behind you when you're given a fresh allocation and you only have a single wire, it's very hard to hold them back, and things do go wrong and they could break through on you, and it can be very hard get them back, and it adds greatly. Whereas if you've your two wires, you just roll up one, let them into the next allocation, then move on another 10 metres or whatever your allocation needs to be, and place the next day's fence. What you do probably need to do, in crops that are waist high or whatever, you'll need to flatten the fence line there. So maybe a slash hook or something, just flatten it down so the wire isn't getting earthed, and that it is safe ahead of the animals.
And then in terms of maximising utilisation, what do you recommend in terms of the size of the feed face?
Yeah, so what we would be recommending with with forage crops, you want to maximise, say, the wire area that you have. You know, if we give a kind of a big square area to the animals, you know, we'll end up with a lot of trampling of the crop there. So what we want to do is have a very wide feed face, you know, give wide, narrow strips to your animals, and that'll, you know, increase the area of the wire. It'll reduce the amount of trampling, and by having it that wide as well, you know, because of herd hierarchies and you know, bullying going on within the herd, it ensures that if it's wide enough, that every animal has fair opportunity and will get the same level of intake that they need to get. You know, that their feed face isn't restricted and they all have equal opportunity.
And I suppose finally, Nicky, if we could just draw on your knowledge of reseeding, we can't predict what way the weather will come in the spring, but what would be your recommendation for getting this area back into grass in the spring?
Yeah, so definitely on milking platforms or anything like that, you know, it's getting these back to grass is going to be our priority in the spring. You know, you shouldn't go with another forage crop or another forage brassica again, because you know, they're kind of suitable to a 1 and 5 year rotation, and that's because of the build up of club root in the soil. So look, we're going to be looking at targeting getting these back into grass, you know, using the PPI to select the varieties. You'd be hoping to get in with an early spring reseed, and we've really seen, you know, early spring reseeds doing well this year. I know it was so difficult this spring gone by to get them done, but you know, we've seen that they were established sufficiently to withstand the drought this year, and they really, you know, serve farmers well. So look, I'd be looking at, you know, getting these fields targeted for reseeding towards the end of March or next April. Really, you know, the forage crop is going to be gone out of them by then. But I suppose put the steps in place now to minimise damage to the soil. You know, animal grazing and the treading from animals is only going to be superficial damage, but it's going in with tractors, putting real deep trenches in your field, that's going to be an issue. And I suppose depending on how good a seed bed you had for your forage crop or the level of damage that's caused to the sward, you know, you probably will get away with a run of a disc harrow and so on with a one pass with your grass. So, you know, we can get a pretty quick turnaround on these, and, you know, the forage crops do fit well into a reseeding programme. I suppose just one other note on the forage crops, you know, we need to be cautious of these, and when we see the yellow flower coming on any of these crops in the spring, it's time to finish up grazing these. So that, you know, we could see that depending on soil temperatures and how early sown the crop was. We could see that from, I suppose, mid-February onwards. We need to be vigilant that we don't have these yellow flowers, because we know that we'll get increased levels of glucose inlates, which are toxic to the animals when this yellow flower is there. So that'll be our cut-off point, and they need to be gone by then. And then we can start looking at our reseeding programme after that.
And just to recap, Nicky, can you give us your top 3 tips to achieve optimum management of forage crops?
One of them will be get the work in the field done now. Get your bales left out, and you'll have a rough idea of where your allocations are going to be going. So that should be done immediately. The double fencing is going to really help with the grazing management and just the workload that you're going to have. And I suppose when you are moving these fences, it should be done at the same time on a daily basis. So do it at about 12 o'clock during the day, and that'll allow any frozen crops to be thawed out by the time you're given a fresh allocation to animals. And also, I suppose, just when farmers are starting to graze these crops, it's important to provide a good lie-back, a dry lie-back to the animals. So if there is a slope in the field, if they can start grazing at the top of the slope, that the animals will have access to the driest part of the field and a dry lie-back for the remainder of the winter months. So those will be just some of my little pointers on it.
Okay, thank you, Nicky.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Nicky Byrne for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.